Jeff Bezos before the show.
So if you haven't heard, Jeff Bezos has lost his mind. He has completely gone insane.
Let's start where everyone thought the story would end, the $5 million wedding. That looked like a designer dream stretched across the canals of Venice. What was sold as a celebration of love quickly became something else, a soft launch for something far more strategic, and beneath the surface of that luxury was tension, a quiet calculation that the rest of the world would only understand after the headlines changed, because this wasn't just a wedding, this was spectacle built with precision. Lauren Sánchez arrived not just as a bride but as a brand, and every image, every clip, every curated guest list moment seemed crafted for rollout, not romance. The gowns were couture, the boats were billion-dollar backdrops, the kisses almost too well-timed, and Jeff Bezos, the richest man on earth, smiled like he knew something the rest of us didn't, and maybe he did, because just weeks later, the entire fantasy collapsed. The flowers hadn't wilted before the divorce papers landed like a missile, and suddenly the fairy tale turned into fallout. And that's where Joe Rogan enters, not just as a commentator but as the amplifier of what many were whispering. Was this even real? Was love ever part of the equation, or was this all just content and currency repackaged as commitment? In one podcast segment, Joe took the entire spectacle and turned it into a meme storm, delivering the kind of takedown only someone with nothing to lose and millions listening can do. He called it out: the luxury, the alliances, the uncomfortable silence that followed. And people listened, because when the guy who built an empire on long-form truth-telling cracks a joke with razor-sharp timing, it lands not just as comedy but as cultural criticism. Rogan didn't just say Lauren played the game, he hinted she built one, a game of optics, where the wedding was the finale to a personal brand series she'd been writing for years. From the moment she stepped into Jeff's orbit, Lauren shifted everything: her media presence, her social circle, her aesthetic, and behind every transformation was a deeper question. Was this evolution or calculation? And as Joe pointed out, you don't marry the richest man in the world by accident, not without knowing exactly what you're stepping into, and more importantly, what you're stepping on top of. This wasn't a random love story, this was a case study in influence. Lauren's ascent from helicopter pilot and journalist to Kris Jenner yacht buddy and wedding headliner was meteoric but also meticulously timed. And with the divorce announcement came the speculation: was this ever about love, or was it always legacy? And if so, what did she really lose when the marriage ended, and what did she gain that no prenup could undo? In the days that followed, the internet split. Some mocked, others mourned, but most watched with fascination, because whether you admired or despised Lauren's rise, you couldn't deny its impact. And when Joe Rogan added his voice to the mix,
Jeff and I are getting divorced. But let's be clear, this isn't a breakup. It's a
quite did the perfection. The pace, the PR machine that seemed to polish to be spontaneous. Rogan's jokes landed like arrows, not because they were mean but because they echoed what people were already thinking. But too afraid to say, maybe Lauren never wanted the man, just the platform. And Jeff gave her the stage.
Pretend he doesn't have choice. He knows he has choice. He has hot women hitting him up all the time. Let's not pretend he's banging hot young women. Just
thought the story would end, the $5 million wedding that looked like a designer dream stretched across the canals of Venice. What was sold as a celebration of love quickly became something else, a soft launch for something far more strategic. And beneath the surface of that luxury was tension, a quiet calculation that the rest of the world would only understand after the headlines changed, because this wasn't just a wedding, this was spectacle built with precision. Lauren Sánchez arrived not just as a bride but as a brand, and every image, every clip, every curated guest list moment seemed crafted for rollout, not romance. The gowns were couture, the boats were billion-dollar backdrops, the kisses almost too well-timed, and Jeff Bezos, the richest man on earth, smiled like he knew something the rest of us didn't, and maybe he did, because just weeks later, the entire fantasy collapsed. The flowers hadn't wilted before the divorce papers landed like a missile, and suddenly the fairy tale turned into fallout. And that's where Joe Rogan enters, not just as a commentator but as the amplifier of what many were whispering. Was this
guys, they're not really built for that kind of a life. And I think even in her choice of friends, again, like she did have stuff going on. She was a journalist, she was a helicopter pilot, she came from nothing and made something of herself. But she's in this position now in life, and
called it out: the luxury, the alliances, the uncomfortable silence that followed. And people listened, because when the guy who built an empire on long-form truth-telling cracks a joke with razor-sharp timing, it lands not just as comedy but as cultural criticism. Rogan didn't just say Lauren played the game, he hinted she built one, a game of optics, where the wedding was the finale to a personal
and have to overcome that. And these are some experiences you know from growing up, because you struggled with dyslexia. So how did you get through that, and did that inspire this book?
This book is, I say all about that. It's for the 8-year-old self, me, who really felt dumb. And I did. I sat in the back of the class. I was just quiet, so they kind of pushed me along in public school, and I kept going. And then I really, really wanted to be a journalist. That's all I wanted to be. And I was like, I can't write. It was horrible. And then I went to community college, and I had this teacher, and she goes, I want you to write for the school paper. I was like, I can't really write. And she goes, well, just write without thinking about, every time I get really emotional, without thinking about spelling or punctuation. And
its impact. And when Joe Rogan added his voice to the mix, it shifted the tone completely. His roast wasn't just brutal, it was believable because it made sense of what never quite did the perfection, the pace, the PR machine that seemed to polish to be spontaneous. Rogan's jokes landed like arrows, not because they were mean, but because they echoed what people were already thinking, but too afraid to say. Maybe Lauren never wanted the man, just the platform, and Jeff gave her the stage, the spotlight, and the scale, until he didn't anymore, and now she's silent. And the silence is louder than any press release hears. Where it all began to sink in for the public, what they had witnessed wasn't a romantic implosion, but a masterclass in image collapse. Because when someone like Joe Rogan, who millions trust for his raw take, strips away the luxury and exposes the levers, the audience doesn't just laugh, they investigate. Every clip of Lauren smiling at Jeff now looked staged. Every glance that once read as love suddenly read like leverage, and it wasn't just fans.
Bride-to-be's bachelorette party in Paris. In fact, the future Mrs. Bezos told the Wall Street Journal in 2020,
following insiders whispering to tabloids that the glamour was all show and no substance. And that's what hit hardest, not the jokes, but the realization that maybe the wedding was never for them, maybe it was never even for Jeff, maybe it was always about launching something bigger, a legacy brand built on proximity to power. And now that power had cut ties, the scaffolding was crumbling. And into that wreckage came the breakdowns, the commentary, the playlists of Lauren's top staged moments, and through it all Joe Rogan's voice served as the anchor, not because he hated her, but because he decoded her, because while everyone else bought the cover story, he flipped it over and read the fine print, and in doing so he didn't just change how people saw Lauren, he changed how they saw themselves in relation to her. Because in a world of curated lives and filtered realities, Rogan offered something rare, unfiltered clarity. And once the illusion shattered, there was no going back. Fans turned sleuths started pulling side-by-side clips of Lauren's pre-Bezos era versus her billionaire chapter, and the contrast was stark. The woman who once flew helicopters and chased news stories now posed like a campaign poster on a yacht. And while there's nothing wrong with reinvention, the problem was in the performance. The idea that the love was real became hard to hold when everything else looked so rehearsed. And the silence that followed only deepened the narrative. Every day Lauren didn't speak was another vote for Joe's version of events, the idea that she wasn't just absent but avoiding, not just hurt but exposure, and that turned the story from a celebrity split into a cultural script, a warning about what happens when influence overtakes intimacy and perception becomes more important than connection. Because what Joe did wasn't just roast her, he reframed her. Every smile, every headline, every curated moment, and suddenly the wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a launch event, the kind you see in tech where the product is sleek, expensive, and ultimately replaceable. And people began to talk about Lauren not as a person, but as a brand in decline, the PR powerhouse who lost control of her own narrative and now found herself silenced by the very machine she built. And through it all, Jeff Bezos remained quiet, composed, like a CEO watching a failed product cycle and prepping the next launch. His moves behind the scenes spoke louder than any statement, locking accounts, canceling appearances, freezing assets. Each step felt less like revenge and more like protocol, a system update on a relationship that had expired. And with every move, the internet cheered, not because they loved him, but because they believed he saw through the act and acted accordingly. And that's where Joe's voice kept resonating. Not because he said it loud, but because he said it first, because he made it funny. And because beneath the humor was a truth people felt but hadn't yet voiced, that maybe love wasn't the point, maybe visibility was, maybe this wasn't the fallout of romance, but the implosion of ambition. And now the aftermath isn't being measured in heartbreak, but in brand erosion. Lauren's image, once glossy and untouchable, now feels dated and exposed, a luxury persona stripped of context. And as Joe's podcast clip circles the globe again and again, it acts like a magnet, pulling the pieces of the story into a shape that makes uncomfortable sense.
About you, about Brooks, that's going to take us by surprise, you think?
I think that the show is, it reveals a lot about, relationship things that I've been dealing with privately that nobody knows about, and just, life post-divorce and living with my sisters in our 20s. It's sort of like a Sex in the City meets Swamp People. We're from the deep, deep South, and we all live in Manhattan now, and we're chasing our dreams, and so...
And you're all stunning, by the way.
What, I'm the prettiest, right? No, just kidding.
Yes, of course.
I'm kidding.
You're all equally gorgeous. And are you still single and ready to mingle right now? Anyone you're interested in maybe, meeting inside?
No, I mean, you never know. I am single and ready to mingle.
Lauren Sánchez, once the center of 1,000 flashing lights, found herself dimmed not by scandal in the traditional sense, but by something more corrosive perception, because once Joe Rogan cracked the illusion, everything she built began to look different. The magazine spreads felt hollow, the yacht photos performative, the friendships strategic, and in that space of doubt, the narrative took on a life of its own. Suddenly every whisper from insiders felt like a confirmation, every meme a metaphor for a brand in freefall. And Jeff Bezos, the man who had once stood beside her in tailored perfection, now felt distant, cold. Not angry, just unlike someone who knew the game and decided to stop playing, and that shook people because this wasn't just a split, it was a strategic collapse. And it started to become clear that this was never about who loved who more or who cheated or who lied. This was about who understood the stakes and who underestimated the audience. And Joe Rogan, he didn't just speak, he clarified. He became the voice that connected all the dots, and his tone, casual, amused, piercing, carried a weight that formal statements couldn't match, because he didn't read from a script, he read the room, and when the room turned, Lauren couldn't turn it back. The luxury influencer narrative that once served her now trapped her. Every attempt to pivot felt like damage control, and worse, it felt late, because in the age of virality, speed matters and silence is a message of its own. Her team may have hoped that laying low would cool the fire, but all it did was feed the suspicion. And so the public kept watching, kept screenshotting, kept commenting, and every move she didn't make became another opportunity for the memes to multiply and the commentary to sharpen. And in this chaos, Jeff Bezos emerged not as a hero, but as something rarer, a man who had stayed 10 steps ahead. People started quoting Rogan like scripture, not because they thought he hated Lauren, but because he seemed to understand the game she was playing and the rules she was breaking. And so Bezos became the quiet victor, not because he dragged her, but because he didn't need to. His silence became power, his restraint became strategy, and the internet loved it. They framed him not as cold, but as calculated, not as cruel, but as clear. And suddenly the prenup wasn't just a legal document, it was a prophecy. Every locked account, every cut tie, every canceled appearance added to the legend of Bezos, the mastermind, and Lauren, the fallen star. And in the middle of all this, Joe's roast kept looping. Fans turned it into remixes, reaction videos, stitched commentary, each one building on the last until it felt less like gossip and more like collective clarity, a moment where everyone saw through the glam and recognized the hustle. And while some admired the audacity, others mourned the loss of authenticity. But no one could look away, because this wasn't just content anymore, this was culture, a real-time reshaping of fame and influence and what it takes to hold on to both. Because what the world realized in those weeks was that celebrity doesn't protect you anymore, narrative does. And if your story falls apart, so does your power. And Lauren's story had cracks that no amount of glam could patch up, and with every new repost of Joe's segment, with every new meme, her position slipped further until she wasn't even part of the conversation about love or power. She was the case study of what happens when the brand becomes the product and the product fails to perform. And Jeff, for all his wealth and influence, didn't have to shout or post or explain. He just had to move quietly, deliberately, like a man who had seen this coming and built his exits in advance. And that's what scared people the most, not the breakup, not the roast, not even the fallout, but the realization that everything might have been planned, that the wedding wasn't just a ceremony but a countdown. And now we were all watching the detonation in slow motion. And that's what kept the audience locked in. Because this wasn't just a story about billionaires, it was a story about perception, about control, about the illusion of authenticity in a world where every smile is strategy and every silence is a headline. And in that space between image and reality, Lauren's brand unraveled, not with scandal but with scrutiny. And once that starts, there's no press release in the world that can fix it. Pins not with a bang, but with what's left in the aftermath. Because now that the memes have settled and the dust has cleared, we're left with something more sobering, a full-scale narrative collapse, not just of a relationship but of an entire brand built on illusion, curated romance, and influencer optics. And in this new landscape, Lauren Sánchez is no longer the dazzling bride in Venice. She's the cautionary tale, the woman who tried to turn marriage into a launch strategy and got caught in the algorithm of public judgment. Because at the end of the day, When Joe Rogan made his now viral comments, he didn't just change how people saw her, he changed how she saw herself, or at least how the world assumed she did. And that's what makes this moment feel so final, because for all the money, all the reach, all the yachts and diamond rings, none of it could protect her from the one thing influencers can never buy: authenticity, and the public could feel that, or more accurately, the lack of it. So what happens now for someone like Lauren? What does a comeback even look like? When the audience has turned your last chapter into a punchline, does she try to pivot, go full redemption arc, maybe lean into the victim narrative, the woman who flew too close to the billionaire son and got burned, or does she rebrand, completely vanish from the limelight only to return years later with a memoir, docuseries, a reinvention? But even if she did, the shadow of the saga will follow her, because what Joe Rogan did wasn't just commentary, it was a reset, a cultural audit of what we're willing to believe and what we're not. And Jeff Bezos, in his silence, played it perfectly, never directly engaging, never defending, never accusing, just making moves like a CEO pulling the levers behind a glass wall, and that approach earned him something rare in modern scandals: dignity. Because while Lauren's side of the story faded under the weight of speculation, Jeff's grew stronger through restraint. And that's the real power move in today's attention economy, saying less and letting perception do the work for you. So what did we actually witness here? A billionaire divorce? Sure. A media circus? Definitely. But also a revealing look at how fame really works in 2025, where every relationship is potential content, every gesture is brand alignment, and every silence is either strategy or surrender. We saw the inner machinery of modern celebrity expose, the gears turning behind the photos, the captions, the public declarations of love, and when those gears break down, they do it in public, in high definition, with Joe Rogan holding the mic and millions ready to meme the fallout. And maybe that's what makes this whole story so addictive, because it's not just drama, it's a masterclass, a real-time case study in fame, failure, and the fragile threads that hold influencer culture together. Because what we're learning is that fame built on aesthetics and access alone can't survive scrutiny. You need substance, or at the very least a story that holds up under pressure. And when that story cracks, when it starts to feel too polished, too strategic, to curated, it doesn't matter how rich you are or how many Vogue covers you land, the audience will clock it, they'll roast it, and in this case, they'll elevate the person who pointed it out. And Joe Rogan wasn't the hero of this story, but he became the lens through which it was most clearly understood. And that's powerful, not just for him, but for every observer trying to understand where the lines are now between entertainment and exploitation, between aspiration and absurdity, between real and real staged. And when it comes to Lauren Sánchez, maybe she did everything right according to the old rules. Maybe she played the influencer game to perfection, climbed every ladder, posed with every right person, wore every right look. But what? Independence at the hands of unchecked wealth. Because if this story turns out to be true, if even a fraction of it is accurate, then we're looking at a future where power is measured not by vision or leadership, but by who you marry and how much you can afford to spend on influence. And that's a dangerous precedent, not just for fashion, but for every industry that relies on public trust and cultural relevance. Because once those lines blur, once the audience begins to doubt the authenticity of what they're seeing, the entire system begins to unravel. And maybe that's why this story refuses to go away, not because it's scandalous or salacious or wrapped in high fashion drama, but because it touches a nerve. It reveals a growing discomfort with the way our world is being reshaped, not by ideas or ideals, but by a handful of people with enough money to do whatever they want. What she didn't count on was the shift in how audiences think, the way we now demand transparency, the way we dissect intention, the way we smell marketing from a mile away. And once we sense it, the spell breaks. And that's what this wedding turned spectacle turned takedown represents, the breaking of a spell. And now we're all a little more alert, a little more skeptical, a little more unwilling to accept beauty and wealth at face value. Because we've seen the glitch in the matrix, and Joe Rogan narrated it with a grin and a mic. And now Lauren has a choice to either disappear and regroup or confront the narrative head on. But either way, the rules have changed. And if there's one lesson from this saga, it's that in a world where perception is everything, even a fairy tale can end in a podcast roast and 1,000 memes of regret. And the craziest part is we all saw it happen in real time, one perfectly lit photo at a time. Independence at the hands of unchecked wealth. Because if this story turns out to be true, if even a fraction of it is accurate, then we're looking at a future where power is measured not by vision or leadership, but by who you marry and how much you can afford to spend on influence. And that's a dangerous precedent, not just for fashion, but for every industry that relies on public trust and cultural relevance. Because once those lines blur, once the audience begins to doubt the authenticity of what they're seeing, the entire system begins to unravel. And maybe that's why this story refuses to go away, not because it's scandalous or salacious, or wrapped in high-fashion drama, but because it touches a nerve, it reveals a growing discomfort with the way our world is being reshaped, not by ideas or ideals, but by a handful of people with enough money to do whatever they want.